So I wanted to take this opportunity to make a quick video here about some choices I've made back in the past. And I want to be clear up front, this is in no way any kind of flex. I've made some bad choices in the past about what cameras that I owned. And not bad from they were bad cameras, but bad from the perspective of I may not have known exactly what I was looking for. And so I've gone through a whole series of cameras to get to where I am today. I want to talk about my perspective as I chose the cameras that I've gone through. And just so you know, I've gone from kind of older school DSLRs, now through mirrorless. I've been through small compact cameras with 1-inch sensors, micro four thirds, full frame, and even at one point up to medium format. So again, you might call it gear acquisition syndrome. I don't really care for that. But I think what drives me when I look at a certain camera system is similar to somebody who may collect watches or maybe even jewelry. This idea of a precision-built, purpose-built device that does something very well and to a very high effectiveness and efficiency, but at the same time having a sense of design style that really intrigues me. And I think that has caused me to go through a whole series of choices over the past. And I think I'm in a good place right now, but I want to kind of show you how I've transitioned over the time. So if you imagine sort of a spectrum from and really both ends of the spectrum achieve the exact same results. A quality image that captures the light, the color, the detail that we're looking for. But there's also a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum is a relatively more, not old-fashioned, but traditional style of photography with the exposure triangle largely under your control, very little done through the camera itself, to the other end of the spectrum. So to illustrate that, I want to bring out one. So this is the first one I want to talk about, and I'm going to be looking down at the device itself. So this is a Leica M9, or correction, sorry, a Leica ME, which is essentially a updated Leica M9. It is a full frame camera from Leica, and it is a beautiful system. If you look even at their cameras today, they're very, very similar in design. They're very, very similar in how they operate. And it's really been since the beginning of the company, probably nearly 100 years ago. But what this does is it's the most essential, quintessential elements of how a camera functions. I mean, you have your shutter speed. Inside the menus, a very simple ISO system. I would not trust it much. And all of their lenses have the aperture control on the lens themselves. So again, very traditional. It functions exactly how cameras have always functioned throughout time, where you control the exposure triangle between shutter speed, ISO, aperture, and then also focus. Focus on this camera is completely manual. You can see it has the range, the focusing range gauges on top, and then you also set aperture on this lens here. This is a relatively inexpensive lens from TT Artisan. It's surprisingly sharp. It functions extremely well. Very little issues optically with it. So these lenses, this one probably costs $250 at most. A good Leica lens can cost you thousands and thousands of dollars. I've been very pleased with this. I have some Voigtlander lenses also that I use with this, much smaller, a nice 35 millimeter that's much more compact. Now about this is it is a rangefinder camera. If you're not familiar with it, you basically look through a optical viewfinder, and inside there you'll see a ghost image between, it uses the effect of parallax, and it brings together, when you bring those two ghost images to form a single image, then you know you're in focus. So for me, with being a 58-year-old man, I struggle sometimes with getting perfect focus. You can use the zone focusing method where you set the aperture at a fairly wide aperture, maybe f8 or f11, and then you have a much deeper depth of field to play with. And so you typically focus in the range where you think you'll be taking a photograph, and that it's much quicker once you get good at it. It's a much quicker way, especially things like street photography or snapshots. You can nail focus every time because essentially where your subject is in focus. Again, beautiful build quality. This is brass on top. I mean, it's an all metal construction, and it's just a complete brick in a good way. The battery life on this, I'm not even sure. I have gone weeks without ever messing with the battery. It just very similar to a film camera. It just keeps shooting. Eventually, I'll realize, hey, I should probably charge that battery. You can see the battery level within there. There is no, on the top, no LCDs, no anything. The screen is very, very low resolution, but that's not what it's intended for. It's intended to take photographs and then download later on. But you can see a beautiful design, and it's just a great piece of kit, but it's not very efficient. I could carry this camera for the rest of my life and be perfectly happy. I've carried it throughout the world and taken some great images with it. But it is on the end of the spectrum where you are more likely than other cameras to not get it in focus or to miss the exposure. And its dynamic range is not the greatest. So, missing the exposure on this can mean a photo that you may or may not be able to recover. So that's one end of the spectrum. Call it the low end if you want to, but it's a very basic, fundamental camera that's beautiful in construction, and its design cues are absolutely perfect. At the other end of the spectrum is a camera like this. So this is a Sony A7 IV, and everything that the Leica is, this camera is not. It is, I would equate it to a surgical instrument. It is extremely well built. It functions perfectly. It takes perfect images almost every single time. Its autofocus is amazing. Its video capabilities, of course, the Leica has no video capabilities, so obviously it beats it there. But it does everything perfectly. Again, similar to the Leica, I could carry this the rest of my life and be perfectly happy carrying this camera. It has never failed me. I've owned a couple of the series of this. I think I started with the second version and have owned every one since. The A7 III was really a game changer for the Sony Alpha series. It's a full frame camera. Again, great battery life, great construction, has never let me down. A great selection of lenses that can go on this. The only problem is it unlike the Leica, it doesn't really inspire any sort of emotion in you. It's a tool, it's a surgical instrument, which you could argue has its own sense of purpose and value, in that it has a purpose. It perfectly serves that purpose. It will function every single time. But again, it evokes very little emotion and feeling towards that. But I love it. I love both of these cameras. They sit at the different ends of the spectrum for me, but I love that entire aspect of it. So I'll tell you where I think I am today. In fact, I know I am today, is this camera here. This is the Nikon Zf. And it truly resides, it doesn't sit in the middle of the spectrum because that would imply that there's some sort of compromise at hand, but it literally covers the entire spectrum. You can see it's much more of a traditional design where it has the exposure control elements on top, the dials, where you've got shutter speed, ISO, the mode selection. This lens here is, one of the kit lenses, I say. It's a 40 millimeter f2 lens. It's designed to look like a traditional lens, and it mirrors that very well. It's mainly plastic, but optically it's very, very good. So I have no issues. It fits the body perfectly. But if you look at it again, almost entirely made out of metal. It's got a very, very good quality build. It's designed to mirror traditional Nikon cameras, purposefully done that way to evoke that emotion. So you could see what the designers were going for, which was to get very close to the traditional designs, but also to incorporate all of the modern aspects of it. Video coming out of this camera, this is not just a photography camera, it also shoots unbelievable video. One thing I like very much about it is the Nikon colors, and you'll hear people talk about this all the time. And it's a fight between Canon and Nikon as far as I'm concerned, but I love the images that come out of it. The images out of the Leica, if you nail it, just Leica cameras just have a specific style. You can tell typically a Leica image. It's very hard to recreate that. Even on what is essentially a modern camera, somehow that style has carried through to the Leica ME. The Sony cameras, much more sterile. You can work with them, great dynamic range. There's a lot you can recreate most looks that you're going for, but straight out of the camera, typically not. What I found with the Nikon is it gives me those colors, that image quality, that dynamic range. The dynamic range that is missing in the Leica and is abundant in the Sony can also now be found in the Nikon. So a lot of latitude to play with the image quality. But I think what it does for me is it is the best of both worlds, where I've got a camera that invokes that emotion of a precision-built design, precision-built instrument that still gives you that sense of this is something it makes you proud to own it. Same with it, Sony as well, but it just doesn't invoke that same sense of style that the Leica does. And I found that the Nikon splits the middle very well. It covers both ends of those spectrums. So I think this is where I'm going to land. I hesitate to use this word, but I think it is what I would call a legacy camera. Definitely the Leica is that. Again, I could own this camera and will own this camera for the rest of my life. And I think the Nikon in its current form, this Nikon Zf, is exactly the same. So I put it in that same category of being a camera that you're proud to own, proud to carry with you, but also produces those types of images that meet or exceed the same that come out of the Sony, a device which is much more, again, sterile, surgical instrument-like, but doesn't invoke that same emotion. So I'm extremely pleased with it. I've taken, with the Nikon, hundreds and hundreds of photos compared to thousands and thousands with the Leica and the Sony, but I have no doubt that I'll get there at some point. So I look forward to any comments you may have. Again, I know for some people, they may be like, well, how is this possible? Again, made a lot of bad choices to get to where I am today, but I think I've finally landed where I want to be with a camera that I'm both proud to own, but also meets all the needs I could ever want. So thanks.